Elvis was 3 chords into That's All Right when the shop owner stopped him. Hold on, the young man said, walking over with confidence. Your hand positioning is all wrong. You're going to hurt your wrist playing like that. Elvis stopped mid-strum and looked at the enthusiastic young shop owner, then at the vintage guitar hanging behind him with his own signature scrawled across it in black marker. He decided not to say anything. Not yet. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Memphis, 1968. Elvis had just returned from his comeback special taping and was feeling restless. The special had reminded him of his roots, of the raw energy that started it all. So he'd slipped out of Graceland in jeans, a plain t-shirt, sunglasses, and drove through his old neighborhood. Union Avenue had changed, but some places remained. Jimmy's music shop had been there since 1952. Elvis had bought his first professional guitar strings from this shop when old man Jimmy Morrison ran it. Now Jimmy had passed, and his son Danny ran the place. 23 years old, Danny had grown up around instruments but never quite made it as a musician. What he lacked in talent, he made up for with technical knowledge. He'd studied music theory, taken lessons from classically trained guitarists, read every book on proper technique. The bell above the door chimed as Elvis walked in. The shop smelled exactly as he remembered. Wood polish, metal strings, old instrument cases. The walls were covered with signed photographs from local musicians who'd made it big. Behind the counter in a glass case hung a 1956 Gibson acoustic, To Jimmy's Music. Thanks for everything, Elvis Presley, 1957. Danny looked up from the counter where he'd been restringing a bass guitar. Help you find something? He asked, barely glancing at the man in sunglasses. Just browsing, Elvis said quietly, keeping his voice neutral. Mind if I try a few? Go ahead. Just be careful with them. Elvis walked over to the acoustic guitar section and picked up a 1957 Martin D28, similar to the one he'd recorded with back in the early days. He sat down on one of the stools, adjusted his grip, and started playing That's All Right, the song that had launched everything, the first song he'd ever recorded at Sun Studios back in 1954. His fingers moved across the fretboard in the unorthodox style he'd developed over years of playing, a mixture of techniques he'd learned from blues musicians in Memphis clubs and his own instinctive approach to the instrument. It wasn't textbook perfect, but it worked. It had always worked. That's when Danny stopped him. Hold on, Danny said, setting down the bass and walking over. Your hand positioning is all wrong. You're going to hurt your wrist playing like that. Elvis stopped playing and looked up at the young man, who couldn't have been more than 25 years old. Oh yeah? Yeah, man. Look. Danny gestured at Elvis's left hand on the fretboard. Your thumb is way too high over the neck. You're gripping it like... He paused, searching for the right comparison. Like you're choking a chicken or something. That's not proper classical position. Elvis bit the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling. I see. How should I be holding it? Danny's face lit up. Here, let me show you. He took the guitar. See, in proper technique, your thumb should be behind the neck, parallel to the fretboard, like this, he demonstrated. This gives you better leverage and prevents wrist strain. Who taught you? I'm mostly self-taught, Elvis said, which was technically true, even if it was leaving out a few important details. That makes sense. Self-taught players always develop bad habits. Danny handed the guitar back to Elvis. Here, try it with your thumb back here. You'll notice the difference immediately. Elvis took the guitar and positioned his hand the way Danny had shown him. It felt awkward, constraining, nothing like the fluid movement he was used to. But he played a few chords anyway, humoring the young shop owner. See, doesn't that feel better? Danny asked, clearly proud of his instruction. Different, Elvis said diplomatically. How long you been playing? Since I was 12. My dad owned this shop. Took formal lessons for 6 years from Professor Henderson at the conservatory. He always said proper technique is the foundation of good musicianship. Your professor ever play rock and roll? Elvis asked, adjusting the guitar back to his comfortable position. Danny laughed. Professor Henderson? No way. He was strictly classical. Bach, Beethoven, that kind of thing. But the technique is universal, you know. Doesn't matter what style you're playing. The fundamentals are the same. Elvis nodded slowly, thinking about all the blues players he'd learned from, men who'd never had a formal lesson in their lives but could make a guitar sing in ways no conservatory professor could teach. That's one way to look at it. Only way, really. Danny said confidently. I see guys come in here all the time, self-taught, playing with terrible technique. Sure, they can play a few songs, but they'll never reach their full potential without proper training. Elvis glanced again at the signed guitar on the wall, his own handwriting from 11 years ago staring back at him. He wondered if Danny even knew who'd signed it, or if it was just another piece of memorabilia his father had collected. That's a nice guitar up there, Elvis said, nodding toward the Gibson. The signed one. Danny turned to look at it, his expression softening. Oh yeah, that was my dad's pride and joy. Elvis Presley signed that back in '57. Dad met him a few times when Elvis was just starting out. Said he was a nice guy, but Danny paused, seemingly debating whether to continue. But what? Elvis prompted. Well, don't get me wrong, Elvis revolutionized music. But Dad said Elvis's guitar technique was pretty rough. Said he played more from feeling than skill. Which works for rock and roll, but it's not real musicianship, you know? Elvis felt a mixture of amusement and something else he couldn't quite identify. Here was a kid who'd never played a note professionally, critiquing the guitar technique of someone who'd changed the face of popular music. The irony was almost too perfect. You ever meet him, Elvis? Elvis asked. Nah, by the time I was old enough to remember anything, he was already too famous to just walk into shops like this. Dad said he used to come in all the time in the early days, though. Before the movies, before Vegas, when he was still hungry and humble. Elvis smiled slightly at that. You think he's not humble anymore? Danny shrugged. I don't know the guy. But you can't be that famous and still be normal, right? Probably has people doing everything for him now. Probably hasn't picked up a guitar without a team of producers and engineers around him in years. At that moment, the bell chimed. An older man walked in, glanced around, then did a double take. Sweet Lord Elvis Presley? Elvis looked up. Hey there. I'll be damned. I saw you at Ellis Auditorium in 1955. Changed my life, son. Danny froze. Wait, what? Elvis stood, removing his sunglasses. Nice to meet you, sir. What's your name? Robert Bailey. I can't believe it's you. What brings you here? Bought my first strings here in '54. Wanted to stop by. Danny stood behind the counter, his face cycling through several shades of red. You're actually... Elvis turned to him with a gentle smile. Elvis? Yeah, sorry about the disguise. Sometimes it's nice to just browse without causing a scene. But I just... Danny couldn't seem to form a complete sentence. I just told you your guitar technique was wrong. You did, Elvis confirmed, picking up the Martin again. And you know what? Professor Henderson probably would agree with you. Classical technique is classical technique. He started playing again, this time with more flourish, his thumb hooking over the neck the way it had always felt natural to him. But this is how blues players taught me. This is how I can bend strings the way I need to. This is how I played on That's All Right and Hound Dog and everything else. The music filled the small shop, unmistakably Elvis even without the full band, without the recording studio magic. Just a man and a guitar the way it had started. When he finished, Robert was wiping tears from his eyes. Danny stood motionless, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. I'm so sorry, Mr. Presley, Danny finally managed. I had no idea. I thought... Elvis set the guitar down carefully and walked over to the counter. Danny, right? That's your name? Yes, sir. Danny, you weren't completely wrong. What you showed me is proper technique for classical guitar. If I wanted to play Bach, your way would be right. He pointed to his own signature on the Gibson behind the counter. But your dad understood something important. There's more than one way to make music. The best technique is the one that helps you express what you're feeling. Danny nodded, still mortified. I should have recognized you. I should have known. Why? I walked in here looking like any other guy wanting to try some guitars. Besides, Elvis smiled. This was actually kind of fun. When's the last time someone gave me an honest critique without worrying about hurting my feelings? Robert laughed at that. Kid gave Elvis Presley a guitar lesson. That's going to be one hell of a story. Can I ask you something? Danny said quietly. Why do you play with your thumb over the neck like that, if it's not proper technique? Elvis picked up the guitar again. Because it lets me do this. He played a bending note, his thumb providing the leverage to push the string in a way that made it wail. Blues players in Memphis taught me that. Big Bill Brunzi, Arthur Crudup, guys who played in clubs on Beale Street, they didn't learn from European conservatories, but they could make a guitar talk like it was human. He played a few more notes, demonstrating the fluid movement between chords that his unorthodox grip allowed. There's nothing wrong with classical technique, but there's also nothing wrong with learning from the music that speaks to you, even if it doesn't follow the rules in the textbooks. Danny watched carefully, and for the first time, seemed to really see what Elvis was doing, rather than just judging it against what he'd been taught was correct. "Could you—" Danny hesitated. "Could you show me how you do that?" Elvis spent the next 20 minutes teaching Danny some of the blues techniques he'd learned as a teenager, the same techniques that had become fundamental to rock and roll guitar playing. Robert sat on a stool watching, occasionally chiming in with questions of his own. When they finished, Danny looked at the guitar in his hands with new understanding. "I've been teaching people the wrong thing," he said quietly. "Or not wrong, but incomplete." "You've been teaching them what you were taught," Elvis said. "That's not wrong, but maybe now you can teach them more. Show them classical technique, and then show them this. Let them choose what works for their music." Before Elvis left, he asked Danny if he had a marker. Danny produced one from behind the counter, hands shaking slightly. Elvis took down the signed Gibson from 1957 and added to his original message, "Still playing it my way, still works, EP 1968. He also signed the Martin D28 he'd been playing, writing, "For Danny, there's more than one right way to play. Keep learning." Elvis Presley, September 1968. "I can't accept this," Danny said, looking at the newly signed guitar. It's worth whatever music you make with it," Elvis interrupted, "or whatever you learn from it. That's what instruments are for." As Elvis headed for the door, Robert called out, "Elvis, thank you for stopping by, for being exactly who I hoped you'd be." Elvis tipped his baseball cap. "Thank you for recognizing me even with the disguise. Saved me from getting a whole lesson in proper guitar technique." Danny managed a weak laugh. "I'm never going to live this down, am I?" "Probably not," Elvis said with a grin. "But you'll tell this story for the rest of your life. And every time you tell it, you'll remember that there's always more to learn. That's not a bad lesson." After Elvis left, Danny stood holding the signed guitar, replaying the encounter. All the times he'd insisted there was only one right way to play, the confidence with which he'd lectured one of rock and roll's greatest guitarists, but also how gracious Elvis had been. Instead of anger, he'd taught, explained, shared. That kind of humility from someone with every right to be arrogant was its own lesson. Years later, after Elvis passed, Jimmy's music shop became a pilgrimage site. The two signed guitars were displayed in locked cases. Danny made sure the second guitar's plaque told the full story. Signed after Elvis graciously accepted a guitar lesson from the shop owner who didn't recognize him. A lesson in humility for both men. Danny became one of Memphis's most respected guitar teachers. He taught classical technique and blues bends. He told every student the story, always ending, "There's more than one right way to make music. Learn all the ways you can, then find the one that lets you say what you need to say." The shop still exists on Union Avenue, run by Danny's daughter. Both guitars hang on the wall. A third display shows a photograph by Robert Bailey. Elvis and Danny sitting together with guitars, smiling, framed with a note from Elvis. "Thanks for the lesson. Keep teaching. Keep learning. Elvis." Because that's the thing about great musicians. They never stop being students. They never think they know everything. They stay humble, curious, and open to learning from anyone, even a 23-year-old shop owner who just told them they're holding their guitar wrong. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that there's always more to learn and that humility is the mark of true mastery. Have you ever criticized something you later realized you didn't fully understand? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible true stories about music's greatest legends.